pulled from the headlines and compiled from the internet. The views expressed are my own, and this is not an actual news story. For entertainment and conversation starter only.
Today, we're not just looking at old news. We're really digging into a key piece of the Jack the Ripper puzzle, the Macnaghten Memoranda.
That's right.
You flagged this document for us, and it's fascinating stuff. It seems to shed, well, a different kind of light on this mystery.
Exactly. And it's invaluable because it was penned by Melville Macnaghten, a high-ranking police official. But crucially, this was written a few years after the main Whitechapel murders.
Ah, okay. So not in the heat of the moment.
No, and it wasn't meant for the public either. It was an internal police document, basically a response to some pretty dramatic claims the Sun newspaper was making at the time.
Sun newspaper.
Right.
And they were saying what they knew who the Ripper was.
They were pointing the finger squarely at a man named Thomas Cutbush, claiming he was Jack the Ripper.
Okay. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. We need to understand why Macnaghten pushed back so hard against that idea. We'll look at his arguments against Cutbush, explore who he thought were more likely suspects, and also pick apart the specific inaccuracies Macnaghten saw in the Sun's reporting.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, let's jump in. Who was this Thomas Cutbush that the Sun was so convinced about?
Well, Thomas Cutbush, he was arrested in April 1891. This was for 2 incidents back-to-back in Kennington.
Kennington, not Whitechapel.
No, Kennington. He'd maliciously wounded a woman named Florence Grace Johnson, and then apparently attempted to wound another, Isabella Fraser Anderson. After his arrest, he was judged to be insane and then detained.
Okay, 1891, that's what, nearly 3 years after the main Ripper murders in 88.
That's right, a significant gap.
And these were woundings, you said, not the really horrific mutilations we associate with the Ripper.
Precisely. That's a key difference, Macnaghten highlights. These were attacks, yes, but not the same kind of brutal signature killings.
So why did the Sun make that connection? Seems like a bit of a stretch.
Well, their reports seemed to focus on Cutbush briefly escaping from Lambeth Infirmary, where he was being held as a lunatic just before they caught him again.
Okay.
And they also tried to link him to some earlier, sort of less serious incidents in Kennington, some stabbing or jabbing attacks.
But were those definitely him?
Not necessarily. Macnaghten points out another man, Cutbush, had actually been arrested for those earlier incidents, though later released. And the nature of the cuts was different again. It feels a bit like the Sun was grabbing at straws trying to build a case.
Yeah, it sounds like a narrative taking shape maybe faster than the evidence could support it. So when Macnaghten did his own digging into Cutbush's past, did anything actually tie him to Whitechapel in 1888?
Well, Macnaghten confirmed Cutbush was born in Kennington, lived there his whole life. He'd worked, respectable jobs, tea trade, canvasser. Had a good reputation then, apparently.
Right.
But around 1888, things changed. He contracted syphilis, stopped working, and his mental state really seems to have declined.
How so?
He developed these paranoid delusions, thought people were poisoning him. He wrote these bizarre, rambling letters, even to Lord Grimthorpe, the Treasury.
Yeah.
Made threats against his own doctor. Clearly, a very disturbed man by that point.
No doubt. Troubled, yes. But any link to the specific timing or location of the Ripper murders? Did the Sun claim he was, stalking the streets of Whitechapel?
There were some stories, yeah. That he studied medical books, that he'd wander out at night, come back with muddy cloths, things like that. But Macnaghten was pretty dismissive. He noted these stories came from Cutbush's mother and aunt, who he described as very excited, all basically not reliable witnesses in his view.
Right. Not exactly objective.
And the crucial point, there was no evidence whatsoever placing Cutbush in Whitechapel on the nights of the actual Ripper murders. Zero.
And what about a weapon? Did they find anything?
They did find a knife on him when he was detained. But, and this is important, Macnaghten established it was bought in Houndsditch in February 1891.
February 91. That's way after the last confirmed Ripper victim, Mary Kelly, in November 88.
Exactly. More than 2 years later. So that knife couldn't have been the Ripper knife.
Okay, so that weakens the Sun's case considerably.
Considerably. Oh, and an interesting little side detail. Cutbush was actually the nephew of a former superintendent executive in the police.
Really? Wow. Okay, so Macnaghten lays out the weak links, the unreliable testimony, the timeline problems. But what's his absolute core argument, the main reason he says, nope, not Cutbush?
It boils down to the sheer difference in the crimes, the fundamental horror. Cutbush's known acts were these woundings, often from behind. Nasty, yes, but nothing like the savage, almost ritualistic mutilations inflicted on the 5 canonical victims.
The canonical 5, right.
Macnaghten is very specific here. He lists them. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. He gives the dates, the locations.
Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Burner Street, Mitre Square, Miller's Court.
Exactly. And he describes the injuries. Nichols, throat cut, some stomach mutilation. Chapman, much worse throat cut, abdomen opened, entrails out, even placed around her neck. It's gruesome detail.
Horrific. And then the double event. Stride, just the throat cut, perhaps interrupted.
That was the theory, yeah. Near that club in Burner Street. Yeah. But then Eddowes, same night. Mitre Square throat cut, terrible facial injuries, abdomen mutilated again.
And then Kelly, the indoor murder.
Mary Jane Kelly. Macnaghten uses the word ghastly for her mutilations. He stresses that being indoors gave the killer time, significant time. He even mentions a photograph exists, implying the mutilation was almost beyond description.
It paints a picture of, well, escalation, doesn't it? Increasing violence.
That's exactly Macnaghten's point. He talks about the fury of the mutilations increase in each case. It suggests a killer spiraling, becoming more frenzied.
So for him, the idea that this escalating killer suddenly stops in November '88.
And then reappears over 2 years later in a different area, committing relatively minor assaults from behind.
Just doesn't fit the pattern.
Exactly. Macnaghten found it psychologically improbable. The M.O., the signature, the sheer level of violence, it was completely different. The 2 sets of crimes just didn't seem compatible in his view.
That makes a lot of sense. The shift is just too dramatic. So if Macnaghten was sure it wasn't Cutbush, did he have his own ideas about what actually happened to the Ripper? Why did the murders stop so suddenly after Kelly?
He proposed a couple of theories. One was that after the extreme violence against Kelly at Miller's Court, the killer's mind just completely shattered.
Gave way, as you put it.
Right, leading possibly to suicide. His other thought was that maybe the killer's family, realizing how dangerously insane he'd become, had him quietly committed to an asylum.
Either way, removed from society.
Removed from society, yes. Both theories fit his idea of a mind breaking down under the strain of such horrific acts.
A bleak end, whatever the truth. Okay, so he dismisses Cutbush, but he didn't just leave it there, did he? He actually named other people he thought were stronger possibilities.
He did. He listed 3 men he considered more likely suspects than Cutbush.
Who were they?
First one was a Mr. M.J. Druitt. Macnaghten describes him as a doctor from a good family.
Okay.
Druitt apparently vanished right around the time of the Mary Kelly murder, November '88. His body was pulled from the Thames about 7 weeks later.
Suicide.
It was ruled suicide by drowning. Macnaghten notes the body seemed to have been in the water for about a month. He also adds that Druitt was supposedly sexually insane.
And the family connection?
This is quite striking. Macnaghten says, based on private information, that Druitt's own family had little doubt but that he was the murderer.
Wow. That's quite a statement. Based on family suspicion, though. Not hard proof.
No, not hard proof, but certainly suggestive, especially coming from Macnaghten.
Okay, Druitt's one. Who was the second name on his list?
The second was a man named Kosminski, described as a Polish Jew living in Whitechapel.
In the heart of the area, then?
Yes. Macnaghten believed Kosminski had become insane due to, and this is his phrasing, many years' indulgence in solitary vices.
Old-fashioned phrasing, but implying...
What?
Degeneracy.
Something like that. He also says Kosminski had a profound hatred of women, especially prostitutes, and strong homicidal urges.
Right.
Kosminski was apparently sent to a lunatic asylum around March 1889. Macnaghten tantalizingly adds there were many circumstances connected with this man which made him a strong suspect.
But he doesn't say what those circumstances were.
No. That's the frustration, isn't it? Just leaves it hanging. Many circumstances. We're left to guess.
Definitely leaves you wondering. Okay, Druitt Kosminski. Who was the third?
Michael Ostrog. Macnaghten calls him a Russian doctor, also a known convict. He, too, ended up detained in an asylum as a homicidal maniac.
Another doctor, another asylum inmate. Seems to be a theme.
It does. Macnaghten says Ostrog's background, his antecedents, were terrible, the worst possible type. And crucially, like with Cutbush, his exact whereabouts during the autumn of '88 during the murders could never be confirmed.
So a known dangerous man with no solid alibi for the critical period.
Pretty much. So you have these 3, Druitt, Kosminski, Ostrog, very different backgrounds, but all linked by mental instability, potential violence, and some connection, however vague or circumstantial, to the time frame or nature of the Ripper crimes.
It certainly shows the police weren't fixated on just one theory, even years later. They were still considering multiple possibilities.
Absolutely. And it highlights just how difficult pinning down the Ripper truly was.
Okay, let's swing back to the Sun and their Cutbush theory. Macnaghten wasn't just disagreeing generally. He picked apart their specific claims, right? What were the big inaccuracies he pointed out?
Oh, definitely. He went point by point. First, that claim about the Sun having a facsimile of the murder weapon, supposedly Cutbush's knife.
Right. The knife we already talked about.
Exactly. Macnaghten reveals it was bought in February 1891, long after the Ripper murders finished in 88. It completely demolishes that piece of evidence.
It really does.
He also questions why Inspector Hale apparently had this knife for 3 years instead of it being logged properly in the prisoner's property store. A bit odd.
Very odd. Okay, so the knife claim was bogus. What else?
The Sun also ran this story that Cutbush made detailed drawings of the victims' bodies, the mutilations, like he was obsessing over the crimes.
That sounds incriminating if true.
If true. But Macnaghten says actually what they found were just 2 torn-up scribble drawings. Women in indecent postures, he calls them. One even used a cutout from a fashion plate.
So not anatomical sketches of murder victims.
Oh, not at all. It sounds much more like, well, crude doodles than evidence of Ripper knowledge. Again, it feels like the Sun was maybe embellishing things quite a bit.
Seems that way. Wasn't there something about an overcoat, too?
Yes. The Sun tried to link a light-colored overcoat found at Cutbush's place to a witness description connected to the Pinchin Street torso case.
The torso case, wasn't that separate?
Completely separate, according to Macnaghten. He details the Pinchin Street find September 89, a woman's torso, no head or legs, found under a railway arch. He argues this Pinchin Street case, along with others like the Raynham mystery in 87 and the Whitehall mystery in 88, were part of a different series of Thames torso murders. Different killer, different methods.
So the Sun was essentially conflating 2 different sets of horrific crimes to try and make the Cutbush theory stick.
That's exactly what Macnaghten implies, dragging in clues from unrelated murders to bolster their Ripper suspect. It's pretty poor journalism, frankly.
It really is. Any other major points Macnaghten debunked?
Yeah, he corrects their claim that Cutbush stabbed 6 girls from behind. Macnaghten says they confused Cutbush's case with that other guy, Collicott, we mentioned earlier. Simple factual error.
Okay.
And he tackles the whole Ripper was left-handed or ambidextrous idea. He points out this came from just one doctor's opinion early on, looking at one victim. Other doctors at the time apparently disagreed.
So the Sun presented a contested theory as established fact.
Exactly, just adding to the pile of inaccuracies and distortions.
It's a pretty thorough takedown of the Sun's reporting. Really shows the danger of jumping to conclusions and sensationalism even back then.
Definitely.
Now, the Sun didn't just focus on Cutbush, did they? Didn't they also suggest there were more Ripper victims than the ones Macnaghten listed?
They did. They brought up 4 others. But Macnaghten explains why he doesn't include them in his canonical 5.
Right. Who were they and why did he exclude them?
Okay, first was Martha Tabram, found August 7th, 1888, so right before the main Ripper spree started.
Okay.
But she wasn't mutilated in the same way. She was stabbed repeatedly, frenzy-like, possibly with something like a bayonet. And she'd been seen with soldiers earlier that night. 2 were arrested, actually, but let go. Different weapon, different MO in Macnaghten's view.
Okay. Tabram out. Who else?
Alice Mackenzie,
Yeah.
July 1889, so much later. Her throat was cut or stabbed. But again, Macnaghten notes no clear evidence linked it back to the 88 murders, and nobody was arrested. The similarity of the wound to Frances Cole's was noted, though.
Frances Cole.
Yes, she's the third one the Sun mentioned, February 1891. Same time as Cutbush's arrest, roughly. Throat cut. A man named Thomas Sadler, a ship's fireman, was arrested.
But released?
Yes, discharged. Sadler was known to associate with prostitutes, had a temper, drank heavily. But crucially, he had an alibi for the night. Mackenzie was killed. He was apparently at sea, sailing to the Baltic. So unlikely he killed both.
Right, so the links are tenuous.
Very. And the 4th one the Sun mentioned was the Pinchin Street torso.
Which we've already established Macnaghten saw as part of a completely separate series of crimes.
Exactly. Different victimology, different method disposal of body parts, not the specific Ripper mutilations at the scene. So for Macnaghten, the pattern just wasn't there for these 4.
So his focus remained very tightly on those 5 women killed between August and November 1888. That specific terrifying pattern.
That seems to be his conclusion, yes. The 5 canonical victims shared a unique and escalating signature that these other cases lacked.
This whole dive into the Macnaghten Memoranda, it really gives you, the listener, a clear view of the official police thinking, or at least his influential perspective, a few years after the panic died down.
It absolutely does. It's a crucial counterweight to all the speculation and, frankly, misinformation that was flying around, especially in the press.
He makes a logical case against Cutbush, based on the evidence or lack thereof, and the stark difference in the crimes.
And even though his naming of Druitt, Kosminski, and Ostrog doesn't solve the mystery,
Far from it.
it shows us the investigation wasn't closed in their minds. They were still looking at credible, albeit deeply flawed, individuals. It shows the complexity they were grappling with.
And it's a stark reminder about choosing sources and being wary of sensational headlines, isn't it? The Sun's eagerness to name the Ripper seems to have led them pretty far from the facts Macnaghten had access to.
Precisely. The memoranda stand as a testament to, well, trying to maintain some investigative integrity amidst a media storm and public frenzy.
So as you sit with all this now, having heard Macnaghten's side, his suspects, his debunking of the Sun, what parts of the whole Jack the Ripper enigma still jump out at you the most? What questions linger? It really makes you think, doesn't it, about how hard it is to untangle fact from myth in these old cases, even with internal documents like this one.
Like, share and subscribe, do all the things. Thank you.